I'm very pleased to be joined by Murdo Fraser, MSP, who has agreed to talk to us today about many things. There's a lot of important matters coming forward in Scottish Parliament to do with the quality of governance, how much we can trust our leaders, and what the state can do to control what we think and what we say. Murdo, welcome. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks, David. Yeah.
Firstly, the news today is all about the report from what is termed the Salmond Inquiry, the committee looking into the handling of the complaints raised against Alex Salmond and the fallout from the government's mishandling of these. Firstly, what's the headline? What's the latest?
Well, the committee has reported today with a very detailed report on what went wrong here. And let's just remind ourselves what this is about. There were two young women who worked for the Scottish Government who made complaints of sexual harassment against the former First Minister, Alex Salmond. And those complaints were never properly resolved because Alex Salmond challenged the procedure that was put in place by the Scottish Government and challenged it successfully and won a court case against the Scottish Government that cost the taxpayer over £500,000 because we had to pay Mr. Salmond's legal costs. And then in a separate development, Mr. Salmond was charged with 13 counts of sexual misconduct and was in due course acquitted by the court on all charges. But the committee inquiry was established to look into what went wrong with the Scottish Government's handling of the complaints. Now, in a very long and detailed report published today, there is a great deal of criticism of the way the Scottish Government acted. It badly let down the women who made complaints. It badly mishandled the legal case taken by Mr. Salmond, and that ended up costing the Scottish taxpayer a large sum due to catastrophic errors and a failure to properly listen to the advice being given to them by the external legal counsel who were hired by the Scottish Government. And the committee has also found that the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, has, in our view, misled Parliament and misled the committee about a number of key events where her claims about what she knew when are not, in our view, credible and are defeated by claims by Mr. Salmond, which in our view are more credible about these events. So it is a very detailed and very serious report, but it casts into doubt Nicola Sturgeon's version of events, and that could lead to her being held to have broken the ministerial code, which would be a very serious matter because a minister who's broken the ministerial code would normally be expected to offer their resignation as a result.
Yes. We'll get to Nicola Sturgeon just in a moment, I assure you. This mishandling of the legal case, though, there's two people. As I've watched the deliberations of the committee, there's two people who've been in front of you with particular significance to the mishandling of the legal case. Leslie Evans, head of the Scottish Civil Service, Permanent Secretary, and Mr. Wolffe, the Lord Advocate, James Wolffe QC. Neither of whom I thought came across well. Is there anything specifically in your report regarding either of them and their performance, and that might call upon them to consider their positions?
The committee report doesn't directly call for anyone's resignation. But what we do highlight is that there were very, very significant failures within the Scottish Government, and we do say that people need to be held responsible for these. Now, the ultimate decision maker around the legal case was Leslie Evans, the Permanent Secretary. And the scale of the errors are such that I certainly would regard it as an immensely serious matter for her. And I think she should be considering whether it is appropriate for her to continue in leadership in the position she's in the Scottish Government, given the scale of the failure we've identified. In relation to the Lord Advocate, one of the challenges the committee faced is that we wanted to access the legal advice, the external legal advice commissioned by the Scottish Government from Roddy Dunlop QC and Christine O'Neill, the two external counsel. And the Scottish Government consistently refused to provide this to us. There were 2 votes in the Scottish Parliament that I led where we demanded sight of these documents. And in both cases, the Scottish Government refused to listen to the Scottish Parliament and showed contempt for the votes of the Parliament. And it was only when we threatened a vote of no confidence in John Swinney, the Deputy First Minister, and it looked like he might lose that some documents were made available to us. But that was after the point where the Lord Advocate had given us evidence. We were not able to properly put these points to the Lord Advocate. And I think that just, to me, encapsulates how unsatisfactory this whole process has been and how the committee has been constrained all the way through its work by a lack of information and a lack of cooperation by the Scottish Government. And this is the case
sorry, it was worse than that, though. Was it not to some extent that James Wolffe, the Lord Advocate, was actually saying, if you, the committee, parliamentary committee, investigating serious matters on behalf of the nation, dare to ask some questions or dare to lead some evidence, then the Lord Advocate and the Crown Office would be considering criminal matters. Was it not getting to the point of basically threatening the committee?
Yes, this is a slightly distinct matter, but nevertheless important, about information the committee had recovered using powers the Scottish Parliament has from the Crown Office, information we thought might be relevant to the inquiry, that we wanted to publish. And we were told by the Lord Advocate, head of the Crown Office, that the Parliament itself would be putting itself at risk of prosecution if the Parliament were to publish this evidence. Now, this is extraordinary. You know, if you put this in UK terms, can you imagine the Director of Public Prosecutions saying to the Speaker of the House of Commons, I will take criminal charges against you if a committee of your Parliament publishes information it deems as relevant to an inquiry which is looking into bad behaviour to the extent of corruption in the part of the government? And in that case, the Speaker of the House of Commons, any Speaker of the House of Commons, would tell the Director of Public Prosecutions where to go. And I'm afraid it did not reflect well on the Scottish Parliament that the Scottish Parliament acceded to the request of the Lord Advocate. And it did not reflect well on the Lord Advocate that he and the Crown Office were determined to use a threat of prosecution to try and obstruct the work of a parliamentary committee.
It is astonishing. It really is. I mean, there is historic precedent for this, because Scotland many years ago, when the government and the King had both gone to London, the Lord Advocate kind of ran it. Why is the Lord Advocate sitting in the Northern Lighthouse Board? Because in the 17th century, 18th century, that was the biggest government expenditure. So he ran that too. But the fact that that sort of approach, that I'm really in charge, do what you're told, is being applied to the Parliament as a whole is simply astonishing. And raises the question about the whole nature of the Crown Office. Maybe we can talk about that later. The degree to which they are unaccountable and utterly opaque in their workings, and so central to so much in Scottish public life, that if there's rot in that particular establishment, it affects everyone and everything. Okay, so we've got Leslie Evans. We've talked about her. I thought her performance was extremely unfortunate. She didn't come across well in front of the committee, despite all of the.
Remember, David, we had to recall her twice to give evidence because the committee was so dissatisfied with the quality of evidence that she gave. She had to be recalled twice, and for somebody who is in charge of the government in Scotland, who is the lead civil servant, I think that's pretty shocking.
So that kind of brings us on to the First Minister, and I suppose the former First Minister. I think if there was someone who came out with credit from the appearance in front of the committee, it has to be Alex Salmond. What's your view on how he came across?
Well, Alex Salmond came across as an injured man. I mean, he clearly believes that he was hard done by. He clearly believes that people conspired against him. And he spent a lot of time setting out his case why he believes that is the case. I'm bound to say, having spent a lot of time looking at this, while there is evidence that supports his position, it is not compelling evidence. I'm not personally convinced he was the victim of a conspiracy. There is more evidence he claims he has that the committee has not been able to access, again, because of legal restrictions. And in any event, the committee was not set up to determine whether there was a conspiracy against Alex Salmond. But he clearly believes there was. And, you know, again, it's extraordinary to think about this. This is the former First Minister of Scotland, the former leader of the SNP, who is claiming that the current First Minister of Scotland and his successor, and somebody he worked with very closely for 30 years, is part of a plot against him, not just to trash his reputation, but to deprive him of his liberty by sending him to prison for crimes that he says he did not commit. And I mean, that is absolutely astonishing. And, you know, put that in a UK context. Imagine David Cameron making allegations of that sort against Boris Johnson. You know, it would be a scandal of international proportions were that to be the case. And, you know, our committee has only just scratched the surface of these allegations from Alex Salmond, because ultimately it wasn't in our remit to examine them more closely. But
well, I think this is one
very strongly about it.
Yeah, I think this is one of the important aspects, that the committee's remit was the committee's remit, but the issues that have been raised here are of such importance to the conduct of Scottish public life that I'm certainly left with a lot of questions. I mean, you said Alex Salmond, crimes he holds that he did not commit, crimes that a jury concluded he did not commit. And the nature of the charges, the timing of the charges brought against him, the nature of the charges brought against him, a lot of which, even if proved, would have been extremely trivial. And the fact that the Crown Office led 14 charges against him, to have them all fail, starts to smell, you know, at what point was that decision made? Was that really in the public interest? Was that an independent decision made by a state prosecutor who was only looking at the law, or was that a politically led decision? Just how independent is the Lord Advocate of political control, and hence how independent is anybody in this country of the risk, or how free is anyone in this country of the risk of being acted upon by the police, by the courts, for reasons unrelated to anything other than the political situation in the country? I mean, these are deeply troubling questions.
And these are exactly the questions being put either by Mr. Salmond himself or by high-profile allies of Mr. Salmond, people like Kenny McCaskill, now a SNP MP and the former Justice Secretary in the Scottish Government. And it does touch on a very fundamental issue that in our report we suggest needs to be considered further, which is this dual role of the Lord Advocate, who is both the head of the Independent Prosecution Service, but also the chief legal advisor to the Scottish Government and somebody who sits in the cabinet alongside the First Minister and other politicians. Now, in England, of course, this conflict existed and was resolved about 2 decades ago, when the Lord Chancellor, who had been a member of the government and also head of the Prosecution Service, that role was changed and the Crown Prosecution Service was created under the leadership of the Director of Public Prosecutions, and therefore an entirely separate prosecution service was created, entirely out with government and political control. And I do think it's time that we in Scotland should be looking at going down a similar route.
Yes, and I think there's further scope as well, because one of the things that's unique to Scotland is the Crown Office, Prosecutor's Fiscal Service, has essentially a complete monopoly in prosecution. There are, for all practical purposes, no private prosecutions brought. And that excludes if it's politically led especially, certain people from justice. We've also got concerns over things like the role in fatal accident inquiries and the investigation of suspicious deaths. There's so much control vested in one office and one man. It's extremely dangerous.
We've also seen, of course, recently in the news, the extraordinary case of the malicious prosecution of the former administrators of Rangers Football Club, where the Crown Office has now admitted in the case, I think, of 5 individuals, that they were prosecuted maliciously. This has led to the payout already of £24 million of taxpayers' money in compensation, and it's estimated the total bill could run to £100 million. I mean, this is almost like what you'd expect from a third world country. If somebody told you in Zimbabwe there were malicious prosecutions of individuals, then you might believe it. But in Scotland in the 21st century, it is absolutely staggering that this could be happening.
Yeah, I was making the point that this is a little unfair to Zimbabwe and third world countries, because the person directly in charge of the malicious prosecution of these entirely innocent men, Frank Mulholland, was of course promoted. He was made a judge. He's now Lord Mulholland. In Zimbabwe, if you cost the state prosecutor the entire annual budget in compensation payments to people you had fitted up, they would take you out and shoot you. But that doesn't happen here. He's made a judge, and the fact that it's admitted it's malicious, it's not an error, it's not ill-advised, ill-judged, it's malicious, and it went on for years. That's organised, and that's a decision, and hence my statement at Queensferry the other week that the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service is organised crime, because that's what we're looking at there, malicious. And where is the law in this? People acted maliciously to try and deprive people of the liberty. That's an unlawful act. Where is the accountability? Where is anyone even losing their job over that? Or where are the prosecutions of the people involved acting maliciously? Is that just allowed now? Is that just part of doing the job?
Well, we took a debate to Holyrood on this, which I led a few weeks ago, to which the Lord Advocate had to respond. We were pushing for an independent judge-led inquiry into this, and we said that judge had to be from a jurisdiction out with Scotland, because it would be extraordinary if one of Lord Mulholland's colleagues on the bench was asked to investigate one of his own colleagues. And the Lord Advocate accepted the need for an independent judge-led inquiry. He didn't accept it would necessarily be somebody from outside Scotland, but that is something we will continue to pursue, because the Crown Office cannot be investigating itself. Clearly, that's a conflict of interest.
And one of the other things, just before we leave the Crown Office, that we're seeing is that the freedom of the police to investigate things seems to be heavily curtailed, because whenever we ask awkward questions to the police, and I see someone put an FOI regarding the Salmond case to ask whether the women who had accused Alex Salmond, and it's gone to a jury and the jury's concluded he's not guilty, whether they were being investigated for perjury. And the response from the police was, well, the Crown Office has not instructed us to do so, so we're not doing anything. And this is often the case when questionable things come up. The police simply say, well, we only do what the Crown Office says. Once asked if they would investigate what we consider to be perjury by a fiscal in court, the Police Scotland response is, we'll only investigate that if the Crown Office tells us to. So it's, again, very circular. There's no independent oversight. There's no accountability from the Crown Office. Let's go on to Miss Sturgeon. Firstly, the 8-hour marathon of memory failure. It was, in its own way, an impressive piece of stonewalling. What was it like to watch?
It was a performance. Nicola Sturgeon, whatever your political opinion of her, is a very capable and competent politician. and she is very able to deal with questions put to her, often by evading the direct point or by answering a question she hasn't been asked. And I think there were more than 50 occasions in the course of those 8 hours where she said she couldn't recall, or she wasn't quite sure, or that information wasn't at her fingertips. And for somebody who is normally so much on top of detail, I think those lapses in memory were perhaps surprising.
Now, it certainly didn't address any of the issues. I think there was maybe a 24-hour period of slight stunned silence amongst her critics, but they quickly returned to the issue that more and more information was coming out, or more and more information was being denied to the public, to the Parliament, to your committee. And again, the story just didn't add up. So it maybe stilled the waters for a day, but the pressure mounted once again. And how do you see this being resolved? Is she going to struggle on to the ballot box in May, and it will be the voters who decide, or do you see it as being a case where, when nothing other than SNP corruption and the future of Nicola Sturgeon as First Minister is being discussed, it becomes such a distraction that she kind of has to go because nothing works with this frenzy of speculation?
Well, what the committee found was that there are a number of areas where what Nicola Sturgeon told us, we simply do not believe is a correct interpretation of events. So we don't believe she was accurate in what she told us and told Parliament about when she first knew about the complaints about Mr. Salmond, about the nature of meetings that was held with Jeff Aberdeen, the former First Minister's Chief of Staff, and about the way in which she apparently, according to Alex Salmond, offered to intervene to help him out when he made his initial complaint to her. She denied later ever making that offer, but there were witnesses who said she had. So a number of significant areas where we don't believe Nicola Sturgeon was frank and straight with the committee. Now, ultimately, the committee is not the final arbitrator of whether she broke the ministerial code. There is a separate inquiry under James Hamilton, who's the former Director of Public Prosecutions in the Republic of Ireland, which is to report on that. But if he finds she has broken the ministerial code, then normally that would be deemed to be a resignation matter for the First Minister. Of course, what complicates this in a way is that we're about to go into an election period, and we're facing an election at the beginning of May, and I suspect Nicola Sturgeon's response might be, well, we've got an election coming up in 6 weeks' time, let the people decide if I'm guilty or not. And if that is the case, if she refuses the demands to step down, despite the fact that is the normal convention, I think what we'll see is the entire election campaign dominated by this question of trust. Can you have someone as First Minister who has now been held to have misled Parliament and broken the ministerial code? And I think that will make for a very difficult election campaign for somebody who is already defending a track record in office, 14 years of SNP government, where many people have looked at the education system, the economy, infrastructure, the health service in Scotland, and haven't seen improvements of anything, and seen it go backwards over that 14-year period. And now a First Minister who we know hasn't been telling the truth to Parliament. I think that will be a very difficult position for Nicola Sturgeon to hold.
The other subject matter I want to talk to you about today, which has disturbed me greatly, it's disturbed a lot of people greatly, is the passage of the hate crime legislation in the Scottish Parliament. Now, your party and a couple of brave individuals from the Labour Party, Joanne Lamont and Jenny Mara, stood against this, and thank you for that. but it went through with SNP, Green Party, Liberal Democrat, and mostly Labour support. And I was trying to find a way to explain to the UK column audience just how I felt about this. And I found a description in the Irish Times about the problem the Gestapo had with their informers and their information gathering processes. The Irish Times wrote, it's been estimated that 15% of Gestapo cases started because of surveillance operation. A far greater number began following tip-offs from a member of the public. Every allegation, no matter how trivial, was investigated with meticulous, time-consuming thoroughness. It's been estimated that 40% of these denunciations were personally motivated. And the Irish Times goes into many cases where, due to some sort of affair within a relationship or other personal animosity, people were being denounced to the authorities. They conclude the Gestapo came to realise investigating false allegations was wasting a great deal of time. A letter dated August the 1st, 1943 from the Minister of Justice in Berlin put it, the denouncer is the biggest scoundrel in the whole country. And I'm looking at this legislation and I'm thinking that is a one-way ticket to that sort of destination. Do you see it in such terms?
I think the hate crime bill is possibly the most sinister piece of legislation passed in the Scottish Parliament. And I mean, let's remember that there are three parts to this bill. Most of the bill is uncontroversial. It's a restatement of existing law. But part two creates new, what are called stirring up offences. Stirring up hatred will be a crime for the first time. And that's in relation to people of different racial groups, people of different religious groups, people from the LGBT community, people who are disabled, and so on. Now, you might think, well, why shouldn't we have laws to prevent hatred? But the real concern has been expressed by a broad coalition of groups, including faith groups, secularists, writers, academics, comedians, people who believe in human rights, is the impact this will have on free speech. And there are lots of good examples given of where this might have a chilling effect on free speech. Probably the best current one is the debate around gender, where you see people like J.K. Rowling making statements which many people would regard as uncontroversial, such as, the definition of a woman is a biological woman and nothing else. And they are denounced as transphobes and full of hatred and should be cancelled and silenced. And the concern about this bill is it will be used as a vehicle for those trying to promote a cancel culture and clamp down on those who have unfashionable opinions. And what's really worrying about this is that, to me, the basis of a free society is to be able to debate unfashionable and unpopular opinions. Most of the things we believe today in society would have been hugely controversial 100 years ago or 50 years ago. The rights of women, for example, the rights of LGBT people, for example. The things we believe now, 100 years ago, would have been regarded as extreme. So how does society ever reform and change if you're not allowed to debate these ideas? Now, the Scottish Government did try and put in some protections for free speech, and that's an improvement, but they didn't change the bill completely. They didn't take out the stirring up hatred offences, and still that concern remains that this bill will be weaponised by people who are determined to silence the opinions of others just because they disagree with them. And I think that's extremely worrying.
Murdo, I can only agree with that, and I think we're going to watch and regret the passage of that bill at some length, and I'm sure we'll be back with many stories of how it's being misapplied and used to essentially socially control people, force them to think or pretend to think in certain ways, and the authoritarian and totalitarian nature of it will be revealed, sadly, through the suffering of our fellow Scots.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there is another aspect of this bill we haven't touched on, and that is that there were attempts at the final stage by Joanne Lamont, who's a Labour MSP, to amend the bill to give these protections to protected groups, also to the protected characteristic of sex. So in other words, protect women from hate crime. And incredibly, these amendments were rejected by the SNP government and many other MSPs. And that leads to the bizarre situation that cross-dressers are protected. So a man who dresses in women's clothing is protected by this bill when a woman herself is not. And that's another good reason why this bill should not be on the statute book.
Murdo, thank you very much for your time today. It's been a pleasure talking to you. We'll come back to these topics many times, I'm sure. But for the moment, thank you very much.
Thank you, David.